What's up, everyone? Welcome back to STF Horror Vault. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we're diving deep into some seriously disturbing stuff tonight. Alaska, the last frontier. Beautiful, deadly, and apparently haunted as hell. Tonight, I've got 8 stories from people who explored abandoned ghost towns across the state and encountered things they can't explain. We're talking phantom miners, ghostly children, and shit that'll make you think twice about urban exploring. These accounts come from real people, mine inspectors, antique hunters, photographers, regular folks who stumbled into something paranormal in places where the dead don't seem to know they're dead. I've changed some names and locations for privacy, but the experiences? Those are exactly as reported. From mining towns frozen in time to schoolhouses that still hold class, these stories prove that some places never really die. They just wait in the darkness for someone to find them. So turn off your lights, put in your earbuds, and let's explore Alaska's most haunted ghost towns. Trust me, you're going to want to sleep with the lights on after this one. Look, I've been inspecting abandoned mines across Alaska for 6 years. I've seen cave-ins, toxic gas leaks, bare dens, and old shafts. All kinds of dangerous stuff. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at Kennecott Mine in October 2023. My name's Jake Morrison. I'm a state mine safety inspector, which basically means I crawl through creepy old mining tunnels to make sure they won't collapse on tourists or stupid kids looking for adventure. Not glamorous, but it pays the bills. So I get this call from my supervisor about Kennecott, this famous copper mine ghost town about 5 hours northeast of Anchorage. People were reporting weird lights and sound coming from inside the mine. And here's the thing. These reports only came in between midnight and 3 a.m. Kennecott operated from 1911 to 1938. When the copper ran out, the company just left. Everything. The whole town's still there, frozen in time like everyone just vanished one day. I've been there before, always during the day with a full crew. This time, night investigation. Just me and this fresh out of college geologist named Marcus Chun. The kid was nervous as hell, and honestly, he should have been. We rolled up around 11 p.m. Even with the full moon, the place looked wrong. The mountains cast these massive shadows that made everything feel like it was drowning in darkness. During the day, Kennecott's a tourist spot. At night, it's something else entirely. Marcus kept checking his equipment over and over. I tried to calm him down, told him it was probably just electrical issues or animals. I was lying to both of us. We geared up, gas detectors, structural assessment tools, LED lights, emergency radios, and headed for the main shaft entrance at exactly midnight. The second we stepped inside, the temperature dropped to 38 degrees. We could see our breath. Our footsteps echoed off the walls like we were walking through a cathedral. We followed the main corridor about 300 yards in until we hit this big circular chamber where miners used to gather for shift changes. I was setting up my gas detector when Marcus grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. Do you hear that? I stopped. Listened. At first, just the usual mine sounds, dripping water, creaking timber, air moving through old ventilation shafts. Then I heard it. Metal on metal. Rhythmic. Deliberate. Coming from deeper in the mine. Thermal expansion, I said, but even I didn't believe it. The sound had a pattern, like someone was working. We followed it down a side tunnel I'd never explored before. The walls got rougher here, hand-carved by the original miners. My equipment said the structure was sound, but something fell off. The clanging got louder. Then we heard voices. Human voices, but speaking some language I couldn't identify. The words had this hollow, distant quality, like they were coming through water. Marcus was shaking. There's someone else down here. Yeah, that's what I thought too. Maybe trespassers. Urban explorers. But as we got closer, the voices sounded wrong. We rounded a corner, and I stopped dead. There was light ahead. Not electric light. The warm, flickering glow of oil lamps. And silhouettes. Human figures moving around, carrying tools, working. I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. My brain kept insisting it had to be a reenactment group or something. But the lighting was wrong. The shadows moved independently, and the figures themselves, I could see through them. Marcus was gripping my jacket so hard I could feel his fingers through the fabric. He was trembling. I reached for my radio to call our supervisor. Static. Just static. We were too deep for normal communication, but my equipment should have reached the repeater we set up outside. Something was interfering. One of the figures turned toward us. I saw his face clearly. A man, maybe 40s, thick mustache, deep-set eyes that glowed with their own light. He wore 1920s mining gear, canvas pants, wool shirt, leather cap with a carbide lamp. And I could see through him, like a double-exposed photograph. He looked right at me and smiled. Raised his hand, greeting or warning, I couldn't tell. Then turned back to work, driving his pickaxe into the rock with mechanical precision. The other figures kept working like we weren't even there. Loading or reinforcing supports, calling to each other in that weird, echoing language. Time felt wrong in that chamber. We might have stood there for minutes or hours. Eventually, Marcus tugged my sleeve and pointed back toward the exit. We needed to leave. Now, we backed away slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever we were watching. Once we were around the corner and out of sight, we ran. Neither of us spoke during the entire retreat to the surface. When we finally emerged, dawn was breaking over the mountains. We'd been underground for over 6 hours, though it felt like much less. We drove back to Anchorage in total silence. The next day at the office, Marcus finally asked what I thought we'd seen. I told him the truth. I had no idea. Every rational explanation fell apart. There was no active mining at Kennecott since 1938. No reenactment groups. The figures were translucent and spoke a language that didn't match any ethnic group that worked there. I filed my official report as routine, no significant findings. I couldn't document what we actually saw because nobody would believe it, but I started researching, and what I found was worse than the ghost miners themselves. According to historical records, at least 37 workers died in that mine between 1911 and 1938. Cave-ins, gas explosions, equipment failures. Many were buried in unmarked graves near the site because their families couldn't afford to transport the bodies home. I believe we witnessed the midnight shift that never ended. Miners who died in those tunnels, still working in death like they did in life. Trapped underground, forever extracting copper that doesn't exist anymore from played-out veins. I haven't been back to Kennecott. I requested reassignment. Marcus transferred to a different department within 6 months, surface projects only. We've never discussed that night again. But sometimes I catch him looking at me across the office with the same haunted expression I see in my own mirror. The reports keep coming in. Lights and sounds at Kennecott, always during midnight hours, always from people who see things that shouldn't exist. I know they're telling the truth. And I know that somewhere deep in those mountain tunnels, the midnight shift continues its eternal work. Antique hunting in Alaska ghost towns isn't just my hobby, it's how I survive. I'm Isabella Rodriguez, and for the past 8 years, I've been traveling across the state, digging through abandoned buildings for forgotten treasures. Some people think I'm crazy. Maybe I am. But there's something addictive about finding a piece of history that everyone else forgot existed. I run a shop in Anchorage called Forgotten Alaska. My customers range from serious collectors to tourists wanting authentic frontier memorabilia. The real money comes from rare finds, original mining equipment, vintage clothing from the gold rush era. Women's clothing especially because so little survived the harsh conditions. That's why I got excited when I heard about Dye. Dye was a boom town during the 1890s Klondike Gold Rush, a starting point for prospectors heading over Chilkoot Pass. At its peak, over 8,000 people lived there. Then the railroad reached Skagway in 1900, and Dyea was abandoned almost overnight. The whole town just left behind. Another dealer tipped me off about a general store there that still had original merchandise from the 1890s. The building had been locked up when the last owner left, and harsh weather kept most treasure hunters away. I set out in September 2023. The drive was brutal. I had to leave the main highway and follow this old mining trail that nearly destroyed my truck. But when I finally saw Dyea in that valley surrounded by mountains, I knew it was worth it. Most buildings had collapsed decades ago, but the general store was still standing. 2 stories, weathered with siding, peaked roof that somehow survived over a century of Alaska winters. The front door was rusted shut, but I found a loose board in back and squeezed through. The smell hit me immediately, with smoke and old leather, dust floating in the sunlight through cracked windows. The main floor still had wooden shelves, a long counter, remnants of inventory, rusted tools, empty bottles, sealed fabric containers. But the second floor? That's where I found it. The living quarters looked like the family just walked away one day. Furniture from the 1890s, photographs, books, clothing hanging in a wooden armoire. This was every antique dealer's dream, an untouched time capsule. I spent hours cataloging everything. A dining set worth at least $5,000. Oil paintings. Complete china set from a prestigious manufacturer. Then I saw in the back of the armoire, partially hidden, a white wedding dress. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Ivory silk with intricate beadwork and lace that would have required hundreds of hours to hand-stitch. 1890s style, fitted bodice, full skirt, long train. But here's what didn't make sense: the condition. After 120-plus years, it looked brand new. The silk hadn't yellowed or deteriorated. The beadwork was intact. Not a single stain or tear. I've handled enough vintage clothing to know this was impossible. Silk from that era should have been brittle and discolored, especially in Alaska's extreme climate. When I lifted it from the armoire, it felt weightless, like it was made of air instead of fabric. And when I held it up to the window, I swear the dress moved slightly, even though all the windows were closed. I decided to take it back to Anchorage. A wedding dress from the Klondike era, in this condition, easily $20,000 to the right collector. I wrapped it carefully in acid-free tissue paper and drove home, thinking about the dress the whole way. Usually when I find something valuable, I feel excited about the profit. With this dress, I felt responsible, like I was being trusted with something precious. I got home late and took the dress to my workshop to photograph it for my records. That's when I saw her, in my camera viewfinder, standing behind the dress, a young woman, early 20s, dark hair in an elaborate 1890s style. Beautiful, delicate features, large eyes looking directly at me through the lens. I lower the camera. Nobody there. I raised it again. She was still there, reaching toward the dress like she was trying to touch it. I set the camera down, heart racing. I've been around antiques my whole adult life. I'd heard stories about objects carrying energy from previous owners. I always dismissed them as superstition, but I couldn't explain what I was seeing. Over the next several days, it got worse. Every time I worked with the dress, I'd see the young woman. Sometimes as a reflection in mirrors or windows. Sometimes in my peripheral vision, standing in corners or walking past doorways. And it wasn't just visual. The dress moved on its own. I'd position it for photography and return the next morning to find it arranged differently, like someone had been handling it overnight. The silk felt warm sometimes, like it had just been worn. I researched the Dyea General Store and found it was owned by the Patterson family. Thomas Patterson ran the store. His wife Margaret took care of their daughter Sarah, who was 19 when they arrived in Alaska in 1897. Sarah Patterson was engaged to marry a prospector named William Hayes in spring 1899. But William died in an avalanche crossing Chilkoot Pass in March 1899, 2 months before the wedding. Sarah died of pneumonia that same winter. Her parents abandoned Dai the following summer, unable to bear the memories. The dress I found was Sarah Patterson's wedding dress. Never worn, never removed from the armoire where it waited for over 120 years. As I learned her story, the activity intensified. I'd arrive at my workshop to find old photographs scattered around the dress. Equipment moved or turned off. Sometimes I'd hear quiet sobbing from the corner where I kept the dress. The final incident happened 3 weeks after I brought it home. I was working late, nearly midnight, when I heard music, soft, melodic like a music box or player piano. I went to investigate and found the dress floating 3 feet off the ground, swaying gently like someone was wearing it and dancing. The young woman I'd seen in photographs was now fully visible, translucent but clearly present, wearing the dress and moving in a waltz pattern around my workshop. She saw me watching and stopped, turning to face me with infinite sadness. When she spoke, her voice sounded far away. I never got to wear it. I never got to dance at my wedding. I stood frozen as Sarah Patterson continued dancing to music only she could hear. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, she gradually faded, and the dress settled gently onto my workbench. The next morning, I carefully packed the wedding dress and drove it back to Dai. I returned it to the armoire where I'd found it, arranging it exactly as it had been. As I left the abandoned store, I swear I heard a woman's voice saying, "Thank you," carried on the wind. I've never gone back to that building. I've never told anyone about Sarah Patterson's wedding dress. Some objects aren't meant to be bought and sold. Some treasures are meant to stay where they are, keeping their secrets and sorrows in the places where they belong. The dress is still there in Dai, waiting in the armoire of an abandoned general store, as beautiful and perfect as the day it was made. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is right, locals say you can hear waltz music drifting through the ruins of the old town, as if someone is finally having the wedding dance that never was. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the old railroad days, back when the Alaska Railroad was the lifeline connecting remote communities. He worked as a conductor for 37 years, riding those rails through some of the most beautiful and dangerous terrain on Earth. I'm Marcus Washington, 24 years old. Unlike my grandfather, I never worked for the railroad professionally. But trains have been my passion since childhood. I collect vintage railroad memorabilia, study historical routes, and spend weekends exploring abandoned rail lines across Alaska. That passion brought me to McCarthy in October 2023. McCarthy sits at the end of one of the most remote railroad spurs ever built in Alaska, the Copper River and Northwestern Railway, constructed in the early 1910s to transport copper ore from the Kennecott mines to the port in Cordova. When the mines closed in 1938, the railroad was abandoned, leaving behind nearly 200 miles of track, bridges, and tunnels that slowly disappeared back into the wilderness. I've been planning this trip for months, hoping to photograph the remaining trestles and document what was left before winter made access impossible. I arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon, driving the notorious McCarthy Road, 60 miles of potholes, washouts, and single-lane bridges that test both your vehicle and your nerve. McCarthy itself has maybe 25 year-round residents. I stayed at a bed and breakfast run by Rose Delano, an elderly woman whose family had lived in the area since the railroad days. Rose was in her 70s with silver hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades of Alaska living. Over dinner that first night, she shared stories about when the train would arrive twice a week carrying supplies, mail, and passengers. My father worked for the railroad, she told me over coffee. He was a section foreman responsible for maintaining about 10 miles of track through some of the worst country you can imagine. He used to say that railroad was built more on determination than engineering sense. Rose warned me about exploring the old rail line alone, especially during short October days when darkness came early. But she understood the fascination and lent me an old trail map showing where the most accessible sections of track remained. The next morning, I set out with camera equipment, hiking boots, and supplies for a full day. The section I planned to document was about 3 miles from town, where the railroad had crossed a deep gorge on a timber trestle bridge. The hike took me through dense forest and rough terrain, showing no signs of recent human passage. When I reached the gorge around noon, I found the remains of the trestle bridge exactly where my map indicated. It was impressive, even in its deteriorated condition. The original structure was built from massive timber beams, some 3 feet thick, arranged in complex geometric patterns typical of early 20th century railroad engineering. About half the bridge was still standing, though clearly unsafe. The missing sections had fallen into the gorge below, where I could see twisted remains of wooden beams and iron hardware scattered among the rocks. I spent several hours photographing the bridge from different angles. The afternoon was quiet except for wind through the trees and distant ravens. Exactly the kind of peaceful, isolated experience I'd been hoping for. As the sun began sinking toward the western mountains, I started packing up. October days are short, and I wanted to be off the trail before full darkness. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound coming from deep in the forest. At first, I thought maybe a helicopter or small aircraft. But the sound was wrong. It was more mechanical, more regular, like the steady chuffing of a steam engine working hard to pull a heavy load up a steep grade. I stopped packing and listened, trying to determine where it was coming from. The sound grew louder and more distinct. It was coming from the direction of the abandoned railroad line, not just the general direction, specifically from the tracks themselves, as if a train were approaching the bridge where I stood. I told myself it had to be industrial equipment, maybe maintenance crews or a mining operation. But as the sound continued growing louder, I began making out other noises underneath. The rhythmic clicking of wheels on rails, the squeal of metal brake shoes, and what sounded like the sharp blast of a steam whistle echoing off the mountain walls. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. There had been no active railroad traffic here since 1938. The rails had been removed. The bridges were unsafe. But my ears told a different story. I grabbed my camera and positioned myself where I'd have a clear view of the bridge approach. The mechanical noises were now loud enough that I could distinguish individual components. The heavy breathing of a steam locomotive, the clatter of multiple cars following behind, and voices calling out in what sounded like work commands. That's when I saw the headlight. A single bright beam cut through the forest darkness, moving along the exact path where the railroad tracks had once been. Behind the light, I could make out the dark bulk of a steam locomotive, its smokestack visible against the evening sky. The engine was pulling what appeared to be a long train of freight cars, all loaded with what looked like copper ore. I raised my camera and started taking pictures. Though my hands were shaking so badly, I wasn't sure any would be in focus. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that shouldn't have been possible. The locomotive was a narrow-gauge engine typical of the early 1900s, painted in the dark green livery of the Copper River and Northwestern Railway. I could see figures in the cab, men wearing the kind of work clothes railroad crews would have worn during the original operation. The train approached the broken bridge at what seemed like normal operating speed, showing no signs of slowing or stopping. I wanted to shout a warning, to somehow alert the crew that the bridge was unsafe. But no sound would come from my throat. I could only watch as the locomotive reached the edge of the intact portion of the trestle. What happened next defied every law of physics I understood. Instead of plunging into the gorge where the bridge was broken, the train continued across empty air, following the path where the missing rail should have been. I could see it clearly, a full locomotive and string of cars crossing a gap of more than 100 feet, supported by nothing but thin mountain air. The phantom train completed its impossible crossing and disappeared into the forest on the other side. The sound of its engine gradually faded. Within minutes, the mechanical noises were gone entirely, leaving only the natural sounds of wind and wildlife. I stood at the edge of the broken bridge for a long time, staring across the gorge and trying to process what I'd witnessed. When I finally looked at my camera to review the photographs, every single image showed nothing but empty forest and the broken remains of the trestle bridge. Whatever I'd seen and heard had left no trace on the digital sensor. The hike back to McCarthy in the gathering darkness was the longest 3 miles of my life. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the headlight of the phantom train bearing down on me. By the time I reached Rose's bed and breakfast, my nerves were completely shattered. Rose took one look at me and immediately made strong coffee, settling me at her kitchen table while I tried to explain what happened. She listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, but showing no signs of surprise or disbelief. When I finished, Rose was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're not the first person to see that train," she said quietly. "My father saw it 3 times during his years working this section. Always in the evening, always crossing that same bridge. He said it was the spirits of the men who died building the railroad, still trying to complete their run to Cordova." She went to an old wooden cabinet and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1923. The headline read, "Train derailment claims 6 lives near McCarthy." According to the article, a locomotive and 4 cars had plunged off the trestle bridge during a winter storm, killing the entire crew. Their bodies were never recovered from the bottom of the gorge. "Every few years, someone sees them," Rose continued. "Always the same train, always crossing the broken bridge, always heading toward Cordova with a load of copper or... My father used to say they'll keep making that run until someone fixes the bridge and lets them complete their journey." I left McCarthy the next morning, cutting my planned week-long visit short. I haven't been back since, and I have no plans to return. Sometimes late at night, when I hear the distant whistle of a modern freight train, I think about those phantom railroad men, forever trapped on their endless run through the Alaska wilderness. The photographs I took that day show nothing unusual, just the broken remains of an old trestle bridge in a remote mountain gorge. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Somewhere in the forests around McCarthy, the last train is still running, carrying its ghostly crew and phantom cargo on a journey that will never end. As a substitute teacher, I've worked in some pretty remote places across Alaska, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the abandoned schoolhouse at Chitina. I'm Emma Thompson, 26 years old. For the past 4 years, I've been traveling between small communities throughout the state, filling in wherever certified teachers are needed. The work is challenging but rewarding, especially when you get to see children in isolated areas receive the education they deserve. Most communities I visit are still active with functioning schools and eager students. But occasionally I encounter places where the schools have been abandoned for decades, victims of economic decline or population shifts that left entire towns empty. Chitina falls into this category. Once a thriving railroad town with over 1,000 residents, it now has fewer than 50 year-round inhabitants, most elderly or running tourism businesses during the brief summer season. I came to Chitina in late September 2023, not to teach, but to research a paper I was writing about rural education in Alaska for my master's degree program. The town's old schoolhouse, built in 1915, was supposed to be an excellent example of early 20th century frontier architecture adapted for educational purposes. I'd received permission from the town council to photograph and document the building, with the understanding I'd share my research with the local historical society. The schoolhouse sits on a small hill overlooking what remains of Chitina's main street. It's a two-story wooden structure with tall windows designed to maximize natural light during Alaska's dark winter months. The building served the community from 1915 until 1987, when declining enrollment forced class consolidation with a school in nearby Glen Allen. Since then, it had been locked up and largely forgotten. I arrived on a gray afternoon that threatened rain. The town felt almost deserted, with most buildings showing signs of abandonment or minimal maintenance. The building's caretaker was Robert Steinberg, who'd been a student there in the 1960s and later served on the school board when it closed. He was in his 70s with thick gray hair and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. Robert seemed genuinely pleased someone wanted to document the school's history. He spent nearly an hour telling me stories about teachers and students from decades past. "That place has a lot of memories," he said as he handed me the keys. "Some good, some not so good. The winters were hard on everyone, especially children who had to walk miles to get to school. We lost a few students over the years to accidents and illness. But the school kept going until there just weren't enough kids left." Robert warned me the building's electrical system had been disconnected years ago, so I'd need my own lighting. He also mentioned some floorboards on the second floor were potentially unsafe, advising me to stay on the main floor if possible. The front door opened with a loud creak that echoed through the empty building. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood and paper. The main floor consisted of 2 large classrooms, a small office, and a narrow hallway connecting to the staircase. Both classrooms retained much of their original equipment: wooden desks in rows, large blackboards, faded educational posters. In one classroom, I found a globe from the 1950s showing countries and borders that no longer existed. The other had a piano in the corner, keys yellowed with age, several strings broken. I spent the first few hours taking photographs and detailed notes. The building was a remarkable time capsule, preserving not just the physical structure, but the atmosphere of a frontier school where children learned to read and write in one of America's most challenging environments. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to explore the second floor. Despite Robert's warnings, I tested each step carefully as I climbed. The boards were soft with age, but seemed fundamentally sound. The second floor had originally been an auditorium and assembly space with a small stage at one end and rows of wooden benches facing toward it. It was while photographing the stage area that I first heard the school bell. The sound was unmistakable, the deep bronze tone of a large school bell ringing in the measured pattern that would have called students to class or dismissed them for recess. But according to Robert, the bell had been removed years ago and donated to a museum in Anchorage. I looked around for any obvious source, but the bell tower I could see from outside was clearly empty. I told myself it must be some kind of acoustic phenomenon, maybe wind blowing through the empty tower. But as I continued working, the bell rang again, this time in a different pattern. 3 short rings followed by 2 long ones. That was the traditional signal for the end of the school day. The third time I heard the bell, it was accompanied by other sounds: chairs scraping against wooden floors, papers rustling, and what sounded like children's voices talking excitedly as they prepared to leave. The sounds were coming from the main floor classrooms directly below me. I made my way back down the staircase as quietly as possible, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening below. When I reached the hallway, I could hear the sounds more clearly. Children were definitely talking, their voices high and animated. I could make out individual words occasionally: homework, recess, Miss Anderson. I approached the first classroom and peered around the doorframe. What I saw made no rational sense. The classroom was full of children, maybe 20 or 25 students ranging in age from about 6 to 14. They were dressed in clothing from the 1940s or 1950s. Simple dresses for girls, knickers and suspenders for boys, practical shoes for walking long distances. At the front stood a woman in her 30s wearing a long skirt and white blouse typical of mid-20th century fashion. Her dark hair was pinned back. She was writing on the blackboard in careful script that teachers of that era would have drilled into their students. The children appeared solid and real, not translucent or obviously ghostly. They were gathering books and papers, putting on coats and hats, chatting about typical school-age concerns. But there was something subtly wrong that I couldn't initially identify. It took me several minutes to realize the children cast no shadows. Despite bright afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, none of the figures produced the dark silhouettes that living people would create. They were there, but not entirely there, existing in some state between reality and memory. The teacher looked up from the blackboard and made eye contact with me. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile that suggested she was genuinely fond of her students. When she spoke, her voice had the clear, carrying quality that good teachers develop from years of addressing classrooms. "Class dismissed for today," she said, though she continued looking directly at me rather than at her students. "Please remember to finish your arithmetic problems for tomorrow and bundle up warm for the walk home. Winter is coming early this year." The children began filing out in an orderly fashion, passing within inches of where I stood. As they walked by, I could feel a slight chill, as if each child were surrounded by a pocket of cold that moved with them. Some of the younger ones looked up at me with curious expressions, but none seemed surprised or frightened by my presence. One little girl, maybe 8 years old with blonde braids and a red wool coat, stopped directly in front of me and tugged on my jacket sleeve. When I looked down, she smiled and spoke in a voice that sounded far away. "Are you our new teacher? Miss Anderson has been waiting for someone to help her with the upper grades. There are so many of us now, and we all want to learn." Before I could respond, the child continued walking toward the front door, joining the stream of students leaving the building. I followed them outside, watching as they scattered in different directions down the hill toward what had once been Chatina's residential neighborhoods. Some walked alone, others in small groups, all moving with the purposeful stride of children heading home after a normal day of school. The teacher, Miss Anderson, was the last to leave. She paused beside me on the front steps and looked out over the nearly empty town below. "We've been waiting so long for the school to reopen," she said quietly. "The children miss their lessons terribly. They keep coming back, hoping that someday there will be teachers and books and proper classes again." She turned to face me directly, and I could see her eyes held a deep sadness mixed with hope. "Will you stay and teach them? They've been without proper instruction for so many years. They deserve to finish their education, to learn everything they were meant to learn before." She paused, and the sadness deepened. Before the accident, I wanted to ask what accident she was referring to, what had happened to these children and to her. But before I could form the words, she smiled one more time and walked down the hill in the same direction her students had gone. I watched until she disappeared around a corner, leaving me alone in front of the abandoned schoolhouse. When I returned the keys to Robert that evening, I asked him about Miss Anderson and whether there had been any accidents involving the school. His expression grew somber, and he invited me inside for coffee and a conversation I'd never forget. "Margaret Anderson taught here from 1952 to 1967, he told me, settling into an old recliner beside his wood-burning stove. "She was one of the best teachers we ever had. Really cared about the kids, went out of her way to help families that were struggling. She never married, said the children were her family." Robert paused to sip his coffee, and I could see he was deciding how much to tell me. "The accident happened in February 1967. There was a terrible blizzard, worst storm anyone could remember. School should have been canceled, but the weather report had been wrong. But it caught everyone by surprise. Miss Anderson kept all the children inside until the storm passed. But the building's heating system failed during the night." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "They found them the next morning when the storm cleared. all of them together in the main classroom where Miss Anderson had gathered them around the piano to keep their spirits up. Carbon monoxide from a faulty chimney. 23 children and their teacher. All of them gone. I spent one more night in Chitina, but I didn't return to the schoolhouse. The next morning, as I was loading my car, I heard the school bell ringing across the empty town, 3 short rings followed by 2 long ones, calling students to another day of learning that would never end. My job takes me to the most isolated communities in Alaska, places where getting supplies can mean the difference between life and death during the long winter months. I'm Ryan Ollie, 35 years old. For the past 8 years, I've worked as a supply chain manager for Northern Logistics, a company specializing in delivering goods to remote villages, mining operations, and research stations throughout the state. It's demanding work that requires careful planning and understanding how quickly weather can turn a routine delivery into a survival situation. Most of my routes involve active communities with real people who depend on our deliveries for everything from food and medicine to fuel and equipment parts. But occasionally I receive requests for deliveries to locations that exist more on paper than in reality. Places where someone still maintains a mailing address even though the community itself has been abandoned for decades. That was the case with LMR. LMR was a ghost town on Prince William Sound that had been a copper mining community from 1897 to 1919. According to my delivery manifest, someone at LMR had ordered a substantial shipment of basic supplies, canned goods, batteries, medical supplies, and other items essential for surviving an Alaska winter. The order was paid for in advance with a cashier's check that cleared without problems. But when I tried to contact the customer by phone to arrange delivery details, the number was disconnected. Company policy required me to attempt delivery even when customer contact wasn't possible. So I loaded my supply truck and headed for the coordinates provided on the shipping manifest. The drive to LMR required taking the Seward Highway south from Anchorage, then following increasingly remote roads toward the coast. The final approach was a narrow gravel track that hadn't seen maintenance in years, winding through dense forest before emerging at the shore of Prince William Sound. LMR sits on a natural harbor that had been ideal for shipping copper or to markets in the lower 48. During its peak years, the town supported nearly 800 residents with all the infrastructure necessary for a thriving mining community: houses, businesses, a school. And most importantly for my purposes, a company store that had served as the commercial center. When I arrived in late October 2023, LMR consisted of scattered building foundations, a few partially standing structures, and skeletal remains of mining equipment that had been too expensive to remove when the copper ran out. Most original buildings had collapsed or been dismantled for salvage. But I could see one structure in relatively good condition. A 2-story wooden building with weathered siding and a hand-painted sign that read LMR Company Store. According to the shipping address on my manifest, this was where I needed to deliver the supplies. The building looked abandoned like everything else in the ghost town. But my instructions were clear. But I'd learned not to question the eccentricities of Alaska residents who chose to live in remote locations. I parked in front and began unloading boxes onto a hand truck. The front door was closed but not locked, opening with a loud creak when I pushed it. Inside, I found what appeared to be a perfectly preserved general store from the early 1900s. Wooden shelves, glass-fronted display cases, a long counter with an old-fashioned cash register. The store still contained merchandise, though everything was covered with decades of dust, bolts of fabric, hand tools, canned goods with labels I didn't recognize, household items essential for frontier life. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of old wood and paper, dust motes dancing in shafts of afternoon sunlight through dirty windows. I began stacking supply boxes near the front counter, planning to leave them with a delivery note since no one appeared to be present. That's when I heard footsteps from the back of the store, followed by a voice calling out in a friendly tone, "Just a moment, I'll be right with you." A man emerged from what appeared to be a storage area behind the counter. He was perhaps 50 years old with graying hair and a thick mustache typical of men from the early 20th century. He wore a white shirt with sleeve garters, dark pants held up by suspenders, and a leather apron that suggested he was the store's proprietor. What struck me most was how clean and well-dressed he looked. And if he just started his workday, rather than spending decades in an abandoned building. "You must be from Northern Logistics," he said with a warm smile. "I've been expecting this delivery for quite some time. I hope you didn't have any trouble finding us." I was confused by his comment about expecting the delivery for a long time, since the order had only been placed 2 weeks earlier. But I assumed he was referring to the challenges of getting supplies to such a remote location. I handed him the delivery manifest and waited while he reviewed the list. "This looks perfect," he said, nodding with satisfaction. "My customers have been asking for these items, and I was starting to worry I wouldn't be able to fulfill their orders before winter sets in." I looked around the empty store and wondered what customers he was referring to. But it wasn't my job to question how people ran their businesses. I helped him carry the supply boxes behind the counter, and he carefully arranged them on shelves with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been running a general store for many years. When we finished, the storekeeper reached into a wooden cash drawer and counted out payment for the delivery in cash. The bills were crisp and new, despite being of a design that hadn't been used for decades. I'd seen enough old currency during my years in Alaska to recognize these were genuine bills from the 1940s and 1950s. Though they looked like they'd been printed yesterday. "I appreciate you making the trip out here," he said as he handed me the money. "I know it's not easy to reach LMR, especially this late in the season. My customers will be very pleased to see I've restocked the shelves." As if summoned by his words, I heard the front door open, followed by the sound of multiple people entering the building. I turned to see a group of men and women dressed in work clothes from the early 1900s. Carrying shopping baskets and talking among themselves about items they needed to purchase. They appeared to be miners and their families, the kind of people who would have made up LMR's population during its active years. The customers moved through the store with familiarity, selecting items from shelves and discussing prices with the storekeeper. They seemed solid and real, not translucent or obviously supernatural. But there was something about their presence that made the air feel thick and charged with energy. As they shopped, they occasionally glanced at me with polite curiosity. But no one seemed surprised or concerned about my presence. One woman approached the counter, carrying canned goods and fabric. She was perhaps 30, wearing a simple dress and shawl that suggested she was a miner's wife. When she spoke to the storekeeper, her voice had an odd, echoing quality, as if it were coming from very far away. "Put this on the Murphy account. John will settle up on payday like always." The storekeeper nodded and made notations in a leather-bound ledger, recording the transaction in careful handwriting as he worked. More customers continued entering, creating a bustling atmosphere that would have been typical of a thriving frontier business. That I watched this impossible scene for several minutes, trying to understand what I was witnessing. The logical part of my mind insisted this had to be some elaborate historical reenactment. But the customers were too numerous and too detailed for any amateur production. They moved and spoke with natural ease, not performers following a script. The storekeeper finished serving his customers and walked back over to where I stood near the front counter. The shopping crowd gradually dispersed, with people leaving in small groups while discussing their purchases and making plans for the rest of their day. "Thank you again for the delivery," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that felt surprisingly cold. "I'll be placing another order in a few weeks once I see how quickly these items sell." Business has been very good lately. I left the LMR company store in a state of confusion and disbelief, driving back toward Anchorage while trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The cash payment was real enough, sitting in my jacket pocket as physical proof the transaction had occurred. But everything else about the delivery defied rational explanation. When I returned to the Northern Logistics office the next day, I submitted my delivery report as a successful completion. Though I didn't mention the unusual circumstances surrounding the customer or the other people I'd encountered, I also deposited the cash payment, which the bank accepted without question despite the age of the bills. 2 weeks later, I received another order for delivery to LMR, placed by the same customer and paid for with another cashier's check that cleared without problems. This time, I assigned the delivery to a different driver, claiming I needed to handle other routes that day. According to his report, the delivery went smoothly. Though he did mention the customer seemed unusually old-fashioned in his dress and manner of speaking, that I haven't returned to LMR since that October day. Though I've requested that other drivers handle any future deliveries to that location. But I still think about the company store and wonder whether it continues to serve customers who've been shopping there for more than a century, conducting business transactions that somehow span the gap between the living world and whatever exists beyond it. I specialize in photographing abandoned places across the last frontier, documenting remnants of Alaska's boom-in bus cycles before they disappear entirely into the wilderness. I'm Zoe Kim, 29 years old. For the past 6 years, I've been working as a documentary photographer, focusing on historical sites that tell the story of human ambition and failure in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. My work has been featured in National Geographic, Alaska magazine, and several museum exhibitions about frontier history. Photography in abandoned locations requires more than just technical skill with a camera. You need to understand the history of the places you visit, respect the memories embedded in decaying structures, and develop an intuition for finding shots that capture not just what remains and what has been lost. Some photographers hunt for dramatic lighting or unusual angles. I've always been drawn to the subtler images that reveal the human stories behind abandoned places. That philosophy brought me to Latouche Island in September 2023. Latouche was a remote location in Prince William Sound that had been the site of Alaska's largest copper mining operation during the early 1900s. At its peak, Latouche supported nearly 1,500 residents and produced millions of pounds of high-grade copper, that was shipped to smelters in Tacoma, Washington. When the copper deposits were exhausted in the 1930s, the entire community was abandoned almost overnight, leaving behind one of Alaska's most complete ghost towns. Accessing Latouche required chartering a small boat from Whittier, a 2-hour journey across often rough waters to reach the island's protected harbor. I'd arranged for the boat captain to drop me off in the morning and return the following evening, giving me nearly 36 hours to explore and photograph the abandoned settlement. IT was expensive, but the isolation meant very few photographers had documented Latouche in recent years. But I was hoping to capture images that would complete a book project about Alaska's forgotten mining communities. The boat dropped me at the ruins of what had once been a substantial pier, now reduced to scattered pilings and collapsed decking jutting from the water like broken teeth. The harbor was eerily quiet except for waves lapping against the rocky shoreline and occasional cries of seabirds overhead. Behind the ruined pier, I could see the remains of Latouche spread across a natural amphitheater formed by low hills rising from the water's edge. Most original buildings had collapsed or been dismantled for salvage, but enough structures remained to give a sense of what the community had been like. Foundations of dozens of houses, the skeletal frame of the company store, and most impressively, the massive ruins of the copper processing mill that had been the economic heart of the operation that I spent the first few hours exploring and planning my photography approach. The late September light was perfect for atmospheric shots, with low-angled sunlight filtering through ruins and creating dramatic shadows across the abandoned landscape that I was particularly interested in photographing the mill ruins, which rose from the hillside like the skeleton of some enormous industrial beast. The mill had been built in stages over several decades, resulting in a complex structure of steel girders, concrete foundations, and massive machinery too expensive to remove when the mine closed. I was setting up for a shot of the mill's main processing floor, when I first noticed something unusual in my camera's viewfinder. Through the lens, I could see what appeared to be a human figure standing among the machinery, partially obscured by shadows and twisted metal. When I lowered the camera to look directly at the area, there was no one there. I assumed it must be a trick of the light or perhaps a piece of equipment that looked human-shaped from a certain angle. But when I raised the camera again, the figure was still visible. And this time, I could see more details that appeared to be a man wearing work clothes typical of the early 1900s, heavy canvas pants, wool shirt, leather cap with a miner's lamp attached to the front that I took several photographs, thinking that even if the figure was some optical illusion, it might create an interesting artistic effect. But each time I looked through the viewfinder, I could see the worker clearly. While direct observation revealed only empty ruins and abandoned machinery, as I continued photographing the mill complex, I began seeing more figures through my camera lens. They appear to be miners and mill workers going about their daily tasks, operating equipment, carrying tools, moving through the ruins with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew their jobs well. Some were more distinct than others, while all shared the same translucent quality that made them visible only through the camera's viewfinder. By late afternoon, I documented at least 20 different figures working throughout the mill ruins. Some appeared alone, focused on specific tasks. Others worked in small groups that seemed to be coordinating their activities. What struck me most was how natural and unstaged their movements appeared. They weren't performing for my camera or trying to communicate with me. They were simply continuing the work they'd done in life, unaware the mill had been abandoned for nearly 90 years. The most compelling figure I encountered was a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, wearing a long skirt and white blouse that suggested she worked in an office rather than on the processing floor. Through my camera lens, I could see her moving between different areas of the mill, carrying what looked like paperwork and occasionally stopping to speak with other workers. She had an air of authority that suggested she might have been a supervisor or administrator. When I focused my telephoto lens on her face, she looked directly into the camera with an expression of mild curiosity, as if she could sense my presence but wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Her eyes held an intelligence and warmth that made her seem completely real and human, despite being invisible to my naked. I spent nearly an hour photographing this woman as she moved through her ghostly duties, documenting what appeared to be a typical workday in the Latouche mill circa 1920. She seemed to be conducting some kind of inspection or quality control process, examining equipment and taking notes in a leather-bound ledger she carried at T1 point. She approached very close to where I was standing and appeared to look directly at me through the camera lens. When she spoke, I couldn't hear her voice, as I could read her lips clearly as she mouthed the words, "Are you documenting our work?" I nodded instinctively, as I realized she probably couldn't see me any more clearly than I could see her without the camera. But she seemed to understand my response because she smiled and gestured for me to follow her to a different area of the mill. She led me to what had been the administrative offices, a section where wooden structures had been built within the larger steel framework. Through my camera, I could see this area was fully furnished and operational, with desks, filing cabinets, as office equipment that would have been state-of-the-art in the early 1900s. Several people were working at the desks, processing paperwork and conducting business related to the mill's operations. The woman who'd led me there pointed to a large chart on the wall showing production figures and shipping schedules. Through my telephoto lens, I could read the dates clearly. They were all from 1927, the peak year of production at Latouche. She seemed to want me to understand I was witnessing the mill during its most successful period, when copper ore was flowing freely and the community was thriving as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruins. The phantom workers gradually became more difficult to see, even through my camera lens. The figures grew fainter and more translucent until they were little more than suggestions of movement in the gathering darkness. By full dark, they disappeared entirely, leaving me alone among the silent ruins that I spent the night camped near the harbor. The next morning, I continued photographing other areas of the abandoned settlement. But the phantom workers had vanished with the daylight. But my camera showed only empty buildings and rusted equipment. When I returned to Anchorage and developed the digital images from Latouche, I expected the figures I'd seen through my viewfinder wouldn't appear in the final photographs. But to my amazement, they were all there. Dozens of ghostly workers captured in various poses and activities throughout the mill complex. The images were subtle and could easily be dismissed as photographic artifacts or processing errors. But I knew what I'd witnessed. The most remarkable photograph was the one I'd taken of the administrative offices. In the final image, I could see the woman who'd led me there sitting at her desk, apparently working on paperwork related to the mill's operations. But more importantly, I could see the production chart on the wall behind her, with all the dates and figures clearly readable. When I researched the historical records of Latouche's mining operations, I found the production figures shown in my photograph matched exactly with the documented output for 1927. There was no way I could have known these specific numbers before taking the pictures. And the level of detail visible in the phantom office was far beyond anything that could have been fabricated or imagined. That I've included several of the Latouche photographs in museum exhibitions. And I never mentioned the supernatural circumstances under which they were taken. Viewers sometimes comment on the atmospheric quality of the images or ask about my digital manipulation techniques, not realizing they're looking at genuine documentary photographs of people who died nearly a century ago. The experience at Latouche changed my approach to photographing abandoned places. I now understand my camera can capture more than just physical ruins. It can document the memories and energies that linger in places where human dreams were built and ultimately abandoned. Some locations retain the imprints of the people who lived and worked there. And under the right circumstances, those imprints can be photographed and preserved. That I've returned to Latouche twice since that first visit. But I've never again seen the phantom workers through my camera lens. Perhaps they only appear to photographers who approach their former workplace with the right combination of respect and curiosity. Or perhaps that single day in September 2023 was a unique moment when the barriers between past and present became temporarily transparent, allowing me to document a day in the life of a community that officially ceased to exist in 1930, that the photographs remain as proof of what I witnessed. Tangible evidence that some places never truly become abandoned, as long as the memories of human activity continue to echo through their empty spaces. Someone has to look after these forgotten places to ensure history doesn't simply vanish into the wilderness without leaving any trace of the dreams and struggles that once filled these empty buildings. That I'm Samuel Blackwood, 42 years old. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a historical preservationist for the Alaska Heritage Foundation, maintaining and protecting abandoned settlements that have significant cultural or historical value. That it's solitary work that requires spending weeks or months alone in remote locations. But I've never minded the isolation. These ghost towns have stories to tell, and I consider myself their guardian and interpreter. The town of Iditarod holds a special place in Alaska's history as the original terminus of the famous dog sled trail that bears its name. Founded in 1910 during a gold rush that brought thousands of prospectors to the remote interior, it grew quickly into a substantial community with hotels, saloons, stores, and all the infrastructure necessary to support a thriving mining district. At its peak, nearly 10,000 people called Iditarod home, making it one of Alaska's largest settlements outside major coastal cities. But like so many boom towns, Iditarod's prosperity was built on a finite resource. When easily accessible gold deposits were exhausted by the early 1920s, the population began declining rapidly. The final blow came in 1929 when a devastating fire destroyed most of the town's commercial district. Rather than rebuild, most residents simply abandoned their homes and businesses, leaving Iditarod to slowly decay in the harsh interior climate. Today, Iditarod exists as a scattered collection of building foundations, collapsed structures, and a handful of buildings that have somehow survived nearly a century of abandonment. The Alaska Heritage Foundation designated it as a protected historical site in 1998, recognizing its importance to the state's mining heritage and its connection to the Iditarod Trail sled dog race that commemorates the original supply route. My assignment was to spend the winter of 2023 to 2024 in Iditarod, conducting a comprehensive survey of remaining structures and developing a long-term preservation plan for the most historically significant buildings. It would be my first extended stay in the ghost town, and I'd visited several times during summer surveys. Winter preservation work is challenging but necessary. An extreme cold and snow loads reveal structural problems not apparent during warmer months. I arrived in early November 2023, flying in by bush plane and landing on a frozen lake about 2 miles from the town site. My supplies included everything necessary for a 4-month solo stay: portable generator, heating fuel, preserved food, communication equipment, and specialized tools for documenting and stabilizing historical structures. I'd also brought extensive research materials about Iditarod's history, hoping to correlate my physical findings with historical records and photographs. My base camp was established in one of the few buildings still substantial enough to provide adequate shelter, a 2-story structure that had originally served as a boarding house for miners. The building required significant temporary repairs to make it habitable, including patching holes in the roof and installing a wood-burning stove for heat. But it provided the secure workspace I needed. The first few weeks passed uneventfully as I settled into the routine of winter preservation work. Days were short during the Alaska winter, providing only a few hours of usable daylight for outdoor surveys. But long evenings gave me time to organize findings and cross-reference them with historical documents. The isolation was complete, but not unpleasant. I'd always found solace in the silence of abandoned places. It was during my 3rd week in Iditarod that I first noticed signs of other human presence in the ghost town, that I began finding footprints in the snow around buildings I was surveying. Fresh tracks that appeared overnight and followed no logical pattern. The prints are made by boots typical of early 20th century workwear, with distinctive heel and sole patterns that matched footwear from the town's active period. First, I assumed the tracks were made by other researchers or perhaps local residents with legitimate reasons for visiting the historical site. But when I attempted to follow the trails, they invariably led to areas where continuing would be impossible: the middle of collapsed buildings, edges of deep ravines, or simply dead ends where the tracks stopped abruptly without any sign of the person turning around. More disturbing was the discovery that footprints appear to be made by multiple individuals moving through the ghost town simultaneously, that I could identify at least 6 different boot patterns, suggesting a group conducting their own survey or exploration. But despite setting up motion-activated cameras and maintaining careful watch during brief daylight hours, I never saw any living person in Iditarod other than myself. The footprints were accompanied by other signs of activity that couldn't be easily explained. I'd arrive at buildings in the morning to find doors that had been securely closed the previous evening standing wide open, with no evidence of forced entry or structural failure. Tools and equipment I'd carefully organized would be rearranged in different patterns, always in ways that suggested someone had been using them for construction or repair work. Most unsettling were the sounds that began occurring during the long winter nights. I'd hear hammering, sawing, or the creaking of timber that suggested active construction work somewhere in town. The sounds were too regular and purposeful to be caused by wind or settling structures, and they always seemed to come from areas where I knew no substantial buildings remained standing. One particularly clear night in December, I decided to investigate the source directly. Armed with a powerful flashlight and wearing my heaviest winter gear, I left my boarding house shelter and followed the sounds toward what had been Iditarod's main commercial district. The temperature was nearly 40 below zero, cold enough to make extended outdoor activity dangerous. But I was determined to solve the mystery of who or what was working in the ghost town after dark. The sounds led me to the foundation of what historical records indicated had been the town's largest hotel, a 3-story structure that had burned in the 1929 fire. Nothing remained above ground except scattered stones and twisted metal fixtures, but the sounds of construction work were clearly coming from this location. When I approached the foundation and shined my flashlight into the excavated area, I saw something that challenged every assumption I had about historical preservation work. The hotel was being rebuilt, not by living people using modern construction techniques, but by translucent figures wearing work clothes and using hand tools typical of early 20th century construction crews, that I could see at least a dozen men working with purposeful efficiency to reconstruct the hotel's timber frame, raising walls and installing roof beams with the practiced coordination of experienced builders. The Phantom construction crew appeared solid enough to handle heavy timber and operate hand tools, but I could see through them to the frozen ground beneath their feet. They worked without speaking, communicating through gestures and expressions that suggested they performed these tasks countless times before. Their movements had the fluid precision of people who knew their trade thoroughly and took pride in their craftsmanship. I watched this impossible scene. One of the workers looked up from his task and made direct eye contact with me. He was a man in his 40s with a thick beard and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors in harsh conditions. When he saw me watching, he smiled and touched the brim of his cap in a gesture of acknowledgement, then returned to his work as if my presence was expected and welcome. I stood at the edge of the foundation for what felt like hours, documenting this supernatural construction project with my camera and taking detailed notes about what I was witnessing. The Phantom workers continued their tasks without pause, gradually rebuilding portions of the hotel that had been destroyed nearly a century earlier. Their work followed the original architectural plans perfectly. Then, if they were drawing on memories of the building's construction during Iditarod's boom years, as dawn approached and the first light of the short winter day began illuminating the ghost town, the Phantom construction crew gradually faded away, leaving behind no physical evidence of their nighttime labors. The hotel foundation remained as empty and ruined as it had been when I first arrived in Iditarod. But the experience had fundamentally changed my understanding of what historical preservation means in a place like this, that I realized I wasn't alone in Iditarod. Then my role as caretaker was being shared with the spirits of people who'd built this community and were unwilling to let it disappear completely from the world. Over the remaining months of my winter assignment, I continued witnessing the Phantom construction crews working throughout the ghost town. Different groups appeared responsible for different buildings. Each crew focused on reconstructing the structures they'd originally built during Iditarod's active years. They worked only at night, and only during the coldest months. Then, if extreme conditions somehow made it easier for them to manifest in the physical world, that I began to understand these spirits weren't haunting Iditarod in the traditional sense of being trapped or tormented by their past. Instead, they were continuing the work they'd done in life, maintaining and rebuilding their community with the same dedication they'd shown as living people. They were the original preservationists, refusing to allow their town to fade into complete oblivion. My final report to the Alaska Heritage Foundation focused on conventional aspects of structural assessment and preservation recommendations. But I included a separate confidential addendum documenting the supernatural construction activities I'd witnessed. I recommended Iditarod be maintained as a protected site, not just for its historical significance, but as recognition that some places retain the active presence of the people who created them. The Foundation accepted my preservation recommendations and has continued to support minimal maintenance work at Iditarod. But they've never commented officially on my supernatural observations. But I know other caretakers who've spent extended time at the site have reported similar experiences. But there's an unspoken understanding among historical preservationists that some locations require protection not just of their physical remains, but of the memories and spirits that continue to inhabit them. I've returned to Iditarod several times since that winter assignment, always during the coldest months when the phantom construction crews are most active. They've come to accept my presence as part of their ongoing work, occasionally acknowledging me with nods or gestures, but never interfering with my preservation activities. We're partners in the same mission, ensuring Iditarod and its stories survive for future generations to discover and appreciate. The ghost town continues to decay slowly under the assault of weather and time, but it will never be truly abandoned as long as its original builders continue their eternal construction project, rebuilding their community one ghostly timber at a time. Metal detecting in ghost towns has always been my weekend escape, a way to combine my professional interest in geology with the thrill of discovering artifacts that tell stories of Alaska's mining past. I'm Ashley Martinez, 33 years old. I work as a geological survey technician for the state, spending most weekdays analyzing soil samples and mineral compositions in laboratory settings. But when Saturday arrives, I pack my metal detector and head for the wilderness, searching through abandoned settlements for small treasures that previous inhabitants left behind. Most of my finds are common items: nails, coins, pieces of mining equipment, household objects lost or discarded during the daily life of frontier communities. Occasionally, I discover something more significant: a gold nugget, a piece of vintage jewelry, or a tool with historical significance that ends up in a museum collection. But it was the discovery of an old prospector's map that led me into the most terrifying experience of my life. I found a map in August 2023 while exploring the ruins of Chisana, a gold rush town near the Canadian border that had flourished briefly between 1913 and 1915. Chisana was unusual among Alaska boom towns because its gold deposits were discovered so late in the territorial period, creating what some historians call the last great gold rush in North America. At its peak, Chisana supported nearly 5,000 residents, making it temporarily one of Alaska's largest communities. Like most boom towns, Chisana's prosperity was short-lived. The easily accessible gold was quickly exhausted, and by 1916 the population had dwindled to fewer than 100 people. Today, Chisana exists as a collection of collapsed cabins and scattered debris in a remote valley accessible only by small aircraft or extremely challenging overland travel. The map was hidden inside a rusted coffee tin I discovered buried beneath the floorboards of what had been a miner's cabin. The tin also contained a few gold coins, some personal letters, and a collection of assaying tools that suggested the cabin's owner had been involved in evaluating or samples for other prospectors. But it was the hand-drawn map that captured my attention immediately. The map showed the Chisana area in remarkable detail, with topographical features, creek locations, and elevation markers drawn with the precision of a professional surveyor. But more importantly, it was covered with notations indicating potential gold deposits, including several areas marked with symbols that clearly indicated significant discoveries. The map was signed and dated, Samuel Kowalski, September 1914. I'd studied enough Alaska mining history to know 1914 was the peak year of gold production in the Chisana district. If this map was genuine, it represented a first-hand account of gold discoveries made during the height of the rush. Even if the marked locations have been exhausted decades ago, the map would have significant historical value. But what made the map truly intriguing were the notations written in red ink around one particular creek drainage. Unlike the other markings clearly related to gold deposits, these red annotations included warnings: "Do not dig here after dark," "Strange sounds from underground," and most ominously, "Johnson and Miller disappeared October 15th. Avoid this area. My scientific training made me skeptical of supernatural explanations for mining accidents. But I was curious enough about the geological features of the marked area to plan a follow-up expedition. The drainage indicated on the map was about 5 miles from the main Chisana town site, accessible by a challenging hike through rough terrain, but potentially rich in both historical artifacts and mineral samples. I returned to Chisana 2 weeks later, equipped with camping gear for a 3-day expedition and metal detecting equipment suitable for more extensive searching. The weather was perfect for late August, clear skies and temperatures that would remain comfortable for sleeping outdoors. I planned to spend the first day hiking to the creek drainage, establish a base camp, then spend 2 full days systematically searching the area for both artifacts and geological samples. The hike to the creek drainage was more difficult than I'd anticipated, requiring navigation through dense brush and across unstable terrain that showed evidence of previous mining activity. When I finally reached the area indicated on Samuel Kowalski's map, I found clear signs it had been the site of extensive gold prospecting, hand-dug test pits, remains of sluice boxes, and scattered equipment abandoned when miners moved on to more promising locations. I established my camp near a grove of spruce trees that provided shelter and a good view of the creek valley. The setting was beautiful but eerily quiet, with none of the wildlife sounds that usually fill Alaska's wilderness areas. Even during the brief twilight that passes for night during Alaska's late summer, the silence was complete and somehow oppressive. I began my metal detecting survey the next morning, working systematically along the creek bed and through areas where previous miners had concentrated their efforts. The detector immediately began registering hits, and within the first few hours, I'd recovered several coins, pieces of mining equipment, and what appeared to be personal items lost or abandoned during the original prospecting activities. But as the day progressed, I began finding objects that didn't fit the pattern of typical mining artifacts. There were pieces of clothing buried in the gravel, far more than would be expected from normal wear and replacement. I found several pairs of boots, all showing signs of hasty removal rather than normal abandonment. Most disturbing were the personal items, pocket watches, wedding rings, and photographs that appear to have been dropped rather than deliberately discarded. It was while excavating around a particularly strong metal detector signal that I made the discovery that changed everything.